In this example, I want to go ahead and talk about the core standards that we have for web pages in this class. Um, Core standards are important because it makes your code readable. It also gives your code a level of professionalism that you're going to need as you head out into the IT industry. And we have some core standards, or think of them as rules, if you will, that are going to apply to all of your HTML pages throughout the semester. So if you're inside your Blackboard course, we're under the course documents section, and then there's the course standards for web pages, and that's where we're starting. Okay, so if we're looking at the standards, I want to go through each one of them with you and kind of show you what we mean by these course standards. So I'm going to go ahead and switch gears and head over to Atom, and I have this untitled document, and I'm going to be skipping back and forth between Atom and my browser so that we can skip back and forth between the coding standards and some actual code. Okay, so inside the browser, the first coding standard is the basic structure of your HTML page. We talked about this in the first screencast, and that is that whenever we have an HTML document, we're going to have certain elements that are always going to be present. Okay, so the elements that are always going to be present are we're going to have a beginning and ending HTML tag, and inside of that we're going to have a beginning and ending head section and a beginning and ending body section. To go along with that, you'll notice that there can only be one set of head and body tags inside of an HTML file. And then all of our other HTML tags have to be inside of an HTML head or body tag. Okay, so how this rule applies, if we're heading over to our editor, is we're going to start with beginning and ending HTML tags. And inside of there, we're going to have a head section with beginning and ending head tags, and then we're going to have a body section with beginning and ending body tags. And now to kind of illustrate what we're talking about with the standards, I wouldn't, outside of the HTML body, have an H1 tag or a table or an image or anything like that. All of that HTML content would go inside of the body. I wouldn't have a reference to an external style sheet outside of the body. I would have my external style sheet reference inside my head section. Okay, so basically the core standards are indicating that we're going to have beginning and ending HTML tags, a beginning and ending head section, and a beginning and ending body section nested within our HTML tags. And we have one and only one of those, and we are not going to have HTML tags outside of these sections. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this as standards. So on my desktop, I'm going to save this as standards.html. And then I should be able to view that in a browser. So if I go to my packages, I can start up the Atom live server. Okay, so live server stopped, and I'm going to start it back up. And it brings up the live server. I can click on that HTML page, and as you can see, and as you would expect, there's no HTML here, but it's rendering my empty page. Okay, so now I can jump over to my tab that has the standards. And the second rule or second standard that we have is tag names and attribute names must be lowercase. Okay, so what we're talking about here is our browsers are going to be very forgiving about stuff that we do. So for instance, I might say that I want an H1 tag. And really what we're talking about here is a big, bold, texted tag. So my example is always cub stink. Okay, so we had talked about this in the last screencast. I have this big, bold H1 tag that says cub stink. And if I go look, you can see the browser knows what I'm referring to. I have a big, bold, texted cub stink. However, to be professional about this, I shouldn't have an uppercase H. I should have a lowercase h. All HTML tags are lowercase. Even though a browser is going to render those things correctly, it's incorrect to code it that way. the browser is going to be as forgiving as possible to you developers. And the reason for that is because really a browser's job is to render content and make it look nice for the end user. But your job as a developer is different than that. So we want to make sure that we have all of our tags being lowercase tags. Okay, so we have this cub stink. We might also have an attribute. So in the last screencast, we used an image, and the image had a source. We can do that again. So I'm going to go out to Google Images. So here I'm going out to Google Images, and I'm just going to search for a baseball logo. Not a log, a logo. And I want it to be an image search. And I'm going to grab the MLB logo. So I'm going to save that image. I'm going to save it on my desktop, MLB. And it's a PNG file. So I'm going to go ahead and add an image tag to this HTML document. So I'm going to have an image with a source equal to mlb.png. Okay, so I have my source, and the other standard is all of my attributes are going to be lowercase as well. So all tags and all attributes. Even though if I have an attribute and I make it uppercase, you'll notice that it renders just fine. My attribute should always be lowercase. So all HTML tags and all attributes are going to be lowercase. Okay, so to avoid confusion, it's not camel case, it's always lowercase. So tag names and attribute names must be lowercase. Number 3 here. So this doesn't necessarily apply to us right now, but we're going to run into situations where there are attributes that will work just fine if we have an attribute value or we don't. And what we're talking about with attribute values, I'll give you a good example of this. At some point in the future, we're going to be dealing with HTML forms. And with an HTML form, you might have a checkbox. So the way I would code a checkbox is I would have an input type equal to checkbox. And then I could say checked and leave it at that. Okay, so you'll notice that I just have that attribute called checked. You'll notice I have a checkbox that is checked. I can uncheck it. But really, this attribute, the attribute name is checked, and there is no attribute value. Okay, so this is an example of me breaking the coding standards, and really the way this should be coded is I should be able to say that the attribute checked has a value of checked. Okay, so I'm always going to have an attribute value. So there's always something on the right-hand side of this equal sign. So I have my attribute equals the value, and the values there's always going to be a value for every attribute is what this standard is suggesting. Okay, so all attributes must have values. Okay, the next one that we're going to get into is all of our attributes must be enclosed in quotes. So if all of our attributes have values, now we have an additional follow-up of this where we're going to say all of our attributes have to be enclosed in quotes. So as an example, if we go back to our input tag where we created our checkbox, on the right-hand side we said that the checked equals checked attribute. We had that quoted. Well, if I'm lazy about things or unprofessional about things, I might leave that unquoted. And even though I've left it unquoted, the browser is still smart enough to figure that out. So what we're suggesting here is that all of our attribute values, whenever we have something on the right-hand side of an attribute, needs to be quoted. And it doesn't matter whether it's single quoted or double quoted, but it needs to be quoted. Okay, so you'll notice that I have a mix of double quotes and single quotes. For professionalism, you probably want to be consistent with single quotes or double quotes, but the reality is it doesn't matter as long as they're quoted. So all attribute values must be quoted. Okay, so that's our standard number 4. Two-sided tags must use closing tags. Okay, so here's another example of where a browser will be forgiving to you. I can have a list of things. So let's say I wanted a bulleted list. And the way I'd create a bulleted list is I'd use this unordered list. That's what the UL stands for. And I have a beginning and ending unordered list. So that's the start and end of my list. And then within my list, I want to put the list items. I want things that are going to show up in my list. What are my bullet point items? The way I would do that is with list items. So maybe I'm talking about a to-do list and I say, get groceries. And then I have another list item, walk the dog. And then I have a third list item, which might be finish homework. Okay, so I have those 3 bulleted items. And if I go to a browser, it's going to look exactly like that. I'm going to have 3 bulleted items. You can see I have 3 bulleted items here. That's the ones that I had created. However, the browser's being overly forgiving to me again. So I have a list item. Here's the start of this list item. And then where does it end? I'm going to explicitly define that, always. So even though the browser didn't force me to end these list items, I'm going to be explicit and say, here's the beginning of the list item, here's the end of the list item. Okay, so that's what the standard's saying is even though a browser's forgiving about these two-sided tags, we're always going to use a closing tag. Okay, the next one, number 6, nested tags must close in corresponding order. Okay, so if we go back over to our editor, what we're talking about here is I wouldn't have a paragraph of text and then an H1 tag saying here is a heading and then a closing paragraph tag and a closing H1 tag. And the reason for that is because this paragraph tag, this P, this closing P, corresponds to the closing P, and really the H1 tag is the relationship I'm trying to describe is this H1 tag belongs inside of this paragraph. Well, it doesn't look that way based on the ending tags. You'll see the H1 tag is not ending inside of the paragraph tag. So I'm not going to have mismatched tags. I'm not going to have a broken nesting structure. So really this H1 tag that I have here, if I want that relationship of an H1 tag inside of a paragraph tag, I'm going to make sure that I close it in correct order so that I do have that nested relationship. Okay, so I have a paragraph, which is just a block of text, and then inside of my paragraph I have an H1 tag. Okay, I'm not going to have mismatched tags, and you'll notice that here's a heading. This is my paragraph tag with that H1. Okay, so I'm on to the next one. Number 7, all one-sided tags must end with a space and a slash. Okay, so I'll give you a few examples of these one-sided tags because we haven't really talked about them yet, but now we're applying a course standard to them. A visible example of this is if I have a horizontal line, so I just want a line, so maybe I'm breaking up sections and I want a line between the 2 sections. The way I would do that is I'd create a horizontal rule. That's what this HR tag stands for. And then I'm going to do a space / greater than sign. And that's how I'm going to create that one-sided tag. Okay, so with that one-sided tag, now I'm going to have that line. So that HR tag is what generates this line. And if I go back over to my browser, I could do that without the space. So you'll notice it works just fine without the space. I could even make it just a beginning tag. And the browser is going to render it just fine. That browser is being very forgiving to me as a developer because it wants to make the experience for the end user an enjoyable experience. Okay, so the standard here for this one-sided tag is I'm going to have a space followed by a forward slash followed by a greater than sign. Another example of this might be I want to put a break in between some text. So I'll have a break tag. We've also seen it with image tags. And we'll see it again for possibly anchor tags. We'll see it for, so these one-sided tags come up anytime we have a tag that doesn't have a child inside of it, meaning text or a different set of tags inside of it. Then we're going to use that one-sided tag to complete that operation. Okay? So all one-sided tags must end with a space and a slash. Okay? Number 8, opening header, nav, and then there's a couple of other ones. So sections, articles, asides, footers, divs. We think of those as block elements, and we'll talk about block versus inline elements. So this one's a hard standard to apply as you're getting started in the semester, so it requires a little bit of memorization for the time being. But all of these tags are going to begin on a new line in the source code with one blank line above them. So if I go back over and I'm looking at my paragraph tag, you'll notice that I have a blank line before my paragraph tag. The paragraph tag's on a new line as its only line. So if I wanted to have a div tag, I would do the same thing. If I wanted to have an article tag, I would do the same thing. Okay, so any of these tags, I'm going to have a space before, a completely blank line, and then it's going to stand on its own, and then I'm going to have a corresponding closing tag. Okay? So those block elements should start on a new line with a blank line above. We have some band tags. Okay, so fonts, big, center are going to be band. And the reason those tags are banned, and I don't even want to cover them with you, because if you haven't seen them, you're not going to use them. But the reason behind this rule is because all of those things that are done with those tags should be done through cascading style sheets. So cascading style sheets, or CSS, is what's going to handle those band tags. So if I have to do anything with alignment or changing fonts or making things bigger, I should be doing that with an external style sheet as opposed to using those tags. Okay? The next one, 10, drive letters may not be used on pathways. So some of you are using Windows, some of you are using a Mac, maybe some of you are using a Linux operating system. What I'm going to tell you is that if I'm using a drive letter in a path, so : / images / if I have this C: or D: or A: or whatever it is, if I'm using a drive letter, it's wrong. Always, 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 it's wrong. So if you're using a drive letter in a path, it's wrong. If that's for an image, if it's for an external style sheet, if it's for an external JavaScript file, anytime I'm using a drive letter, it's wrong. Okay, so in Windows, we have drive letters, and drive letters are wrong. On a Mac, we don't have drive letters. So on a Mac, I might have something like users / images. If I have a / to start my path, it's wrong on a Mac or on a Linux-based operating system, on a Unix-based operating system. So drive letters are wrong, / are typically wrong to start your path. Okay, so the coding standard just talks about drive letters, but if I'm using an absolute path, it's typically wrong. If you can't get it to work without using that drive letter, then you need to get help fixing it so that you're not using that drive letter. And so I say it's wrong but really I want to give you an explanation of why it's wrong. So I tell you it's wrong, it's always wrong, you got to get it fixed. And the reason why it's wrong and it's always wrong is because when we're building HTML, it is not necessarily built to run on your computer. So yes, your computer might have a C drive with a pictures folder, and that's where the image might be on your computer, but that's not where your HTML file is going to run. And because it's not going to run on that machine or that computer, then the computer where it is going to run is going to need that same drive letter and that same directory, and chances are it doesn't have that. So what we really want to do to fix it, and we have it correct here, is that we want to use a relative path, meaning relative to our current HTML document, where is this other file? Like, how do I navigate to that file from my current location, and my current location being this current HTML file? So relative to this HTML file, where's this image? It's in the same directory, so I don't have to give it a path. Okay, so I don't have to use a drive letter. In our first screencast that we looked at, we talked about having an images folder, and I could certainly do that. I could say go into the images folder and then look for this image. Okay, so relative to this HTML file, I'm expecting there to be an images folder next to it as a sibling, and then this file, mlb.png. Okay, so we always want to use relative paths as opposed to drive letters. Okay, and that's what this coding standard is suggesting, is we can't use drive letters. Number 11, the alt attribute must always be used with images. Okay, so this gets into accessibility. So let's assume that I have a reader or a viewer of my website that has a visual impairment and can't see that image. They might be using a screen reader. So with that screen reader, the screen reader is not going to read an image. What it's going to read is this alternative text. So with all images, I'm going to provide alternative text describing what the image actually is. So you'll notice this image now has multiple attributes, an alt tag and a source. The alt tag is going to come into play for those screen readers. It's also going to come into play if, for instance, this image can't get rendered. For some reason, maybe I give it the wrong path. If I give it the wrong path, this alternative text will show up. Okay, so this alternative text is required for every image, and the idea behind this alternative text is I'm giving alternative text to describe the image. So always, always, always the alt tag is going to be used with images. Number 12, ID values must be unique and contain no blanks. An ID for an HTML element is unique. So I'm going to have an ID. My ID is not going to be MLB logo. My ID, I might want to call it an MLB logo because that's a great ID for this image. But if I'm going to use that, then I'm not going to have a space. Okay, so I'm not going to say MLB space logo. I'm going to use all one word. To kind of further this point, I'm not going to repeat this ID for something else. Okay, so even if I think that that name was a good name for my HTML element, I'm going to choose something else. And the reason why is IDs are supposed to be unique. Okay, and you might be thinking, well, why would I ever have the same ID? Well, you've all dealt with forms where you enter your password and then you re-enter your password. Well, the ID for the first one might be password, and then the second one, instead of re-enter your password, you might name the ID password. It makes sense. They're both passwords. We're going to avoid that. So IDs need to be unique. Okay, so we're not going to have duplicate ID. And then we're also not going to be in a situation where an ID has a space in the ID. Okay, so we're going to eliminate space. Okay, so each web page has to have some comments. Okay, so a couple of examples of comments. So if I want to use a comment in HTML, maybe this is my headline, so I want to comment out that this is my headline. Okay, so this is my headline text. Less than, exclamation point, dash dash, dash dash greater than, to begin and end single line comment. So this comment is going to start here and end here, and it's for a single line comment. If I wanted to have a multi-line comment, I can typically do that with /* star /. With HTML, that's not the case. So in a lot of environments, you'll have that multi-line comment, or a lot of people will use that as a single line comment as well. So we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. With HTML, we're going to have our comment where we have beginning and ending comment blocks. With style sheets, it's a different way to comment your code. Okay, so I'm just showing you different syntax for different comments in HTML. So let's focus on HTML for now. We're going to have a beginning comment, an ending comment, and I had lied, or misspoke. I shouldn't say lied, because it's not an unintentional. I can have additional comments here. It can be a multi-line comment inside of our HTML document. Okay, so I just have some dummy text here as a comment. Okay, so usually what we're going to do with a comment is we're going to describe what we're doing in our HTML. So this is a comment. Maybe we want to be descriptive. This code was written by Brian Witkowski on a specific date. So I might want to put a date in here. Okay, to give a description like, hey, I wrote it on this day, and this is why it looks this way. So this is what I'm going to do with my comments, is just kind of give a written description. So if someone's looking at the file, they can kind of gather like, hey, this is what's going on here. Okay, so we will have comments to describe our code. Number 14, tags associated with tables are banned until Project 3. Okay, so until we get to Project 3, we are not going to use tables. So no tables. And the reason for this ban, tables are great for HTML. HTML is really good at rendering HTML tables, and tables are really important. There's a lot of data that's out on the web that should be in a table. However, the rule's in place because we can use tables to start to style our web pages. And that was actually done for a long time. Before style sheets, tables were used to lay out web pages. So we're banning tables until Project 3 for this semester. So if you know about tables and you've worked with HTML before, you're out of luck. You can't use them until Project 3. Okay, so 14, I'm ignoring table tags for now. If you know about table tags, don't use them until Project 3. 15, only external style sheets should be used. Okay, so what that means is I'm not going to style my HTML by using a style tag inside of my HTML file. Okay, I could do this. I could have my style rules all included in my HTML, just have one big file. But what we want to do is, instead of using these style rules inside of our HTML, I want to have an external style sheet. Okay, and we'll worry about the syntax of an external style sheet, but we're going to have some kind of reference, we're going to have a type, yeah, we're going to have external style sheets for any styling rules that we'd want to put in place. Okay. You'll notice as I'm typing, I'm a little hesitant to type, and maybe you've played around with Atom a little bit now, so as you downloaded it, you started to play around with it a little bit. One cool thing that Atom does is it has snippets. So if I type in link you'll notice that link comes up in this IntelliSense. So link is here, and what it really indicates to me is that there's a keyboard shortcut associated with it built into Atom. So if I hit the tab key now, it'll automatically fill in kind of the template of how I would include an external style sheet. So as long as I know what I'm doing, I can use these keyboard shortcuts. Atom has built-in keyboard shortcuts. And there's a ton of them, and we'll get into them as the semester goes. Excuse me. So for now, all we're talking about in terms of our coding standards is that if we're going to have style rules, those style rules belong in an external style sheet. Okay, so we're going to have them in an external style sheet. Okay, and then the last one that I want to cover for tonight is that ID selectors must specify an element name to the left of the pound sign. This is kind of getting a little bit out there in terms of what we're doing at this point of the semester. But if I have an external style sheet, so right now I'm saying I have an external style sheet. So let's go ahead and create that external style sheet. So I have a folder called CSS. And then in that folder, I have a new file called master.css. If I have a selector, so I want a style rule to apply to something. Okay, so for instance, I have this H1 tag, and I'm going to give it an ID called headline. Okay, so that's my headline, Cub Stink. I want a style rule to apply to that headline. I can select that headline using the pound sign. And what I mean by select that headline is then any rule that I put in place in between these beginning and ending curly braces is going to apply to that HTML element that has a matching ID called headline. So that's how things match up, is I have this external style sheet, and I'm saying that I want to have a style rule applied to this H1 tag. And the way I'm going to define that style rule is I have to basically say this style rule applies to the HTML element that has an ID of headline. So that's what this is a CSS selector, and the selector is saying all of the HTML elements that have an ID of headline should have these style rules. And then the style rules would go in place in between these curly braces. So for instance, I might want to say that the color is red. Okay, so I want that headline color to be red, and I got to save the page, so I don't want to leave here, so I save the style sheet. And now you'll notice that our headline, Cub Stink, is red. So that style rule is applying to that 1H1 tag that has an ID of headline. Okay, so where the course standard comes into play is that if I have an element name, if I have a pound sign, then the element ID has to be next to the pound sign. Okay, so it's just defining how this CSS selector is working. Okay, so again, this is kind of a quick, brief introduction to what the course coding standards are. And as the semester goes, we'll get more and more familiar with the coding standards. We'll get more and more familiar with the elements that are referenced in the coding standards. But the coding standards are there. You're going to be graded based on these coding standards. And the coding standards can all be found in the course documents section of this website. So if I go to the course documents section of this website, there's the course coding standards. So these coding standards are what you're following for the exercises, for the projects that you're going to complete throughout this semester. Okay? In addition to the course coding standards, this week, so week 1B, we're also going to have a few external resources that I'm going to have you look at. And if you look at exercise 2, which is from week 1B, so if you look at exercise 2 doesn't cover anything that we just looked at in the screencast. It doesn't look at these coding standards at all. So the course rules or HTML rules and course coding standards, you'll notice that they're not really in exercise 2. Exercise 2 is all based on external resources. And what the external resources are is, one is you're going to run into an HTML validator. 2, you're going to do some kind of performance optimization, and you're going to look at tools that would allow you to do that, like how do you minimize your file size and stuff like that. And then 3, how do we deal with responsive web design, and what is responsive web design? So how do we deal with the fact that our HTML pages are going to get rendered in browsers that are on a desktop versus our web page getting rendered in a browser that's on a mobile phone, and how that's going to look different. So we're going to cover responsive web design as well, but those are going to be in external resources. So I want you to look over those external resources and know that exercise 2 is really utilizing those external resources.